Well, let's just make a start with a little bit of historical background. And if we go back to the 19th century, what you've got in Britain is the first successful, decisive breakthrough for capitalism. So if we look at, various Italian cities or the Netherlands, the development of capitalism there was blocked for various reasons. But here in Britain, there was a decisive breakthrough for capitalism. And I mean, it's interesting just to look at Engels's The Condition of the Working Class in England, and also the impact that Britain made on Marx. And basically what you've got is him moving away from sort of being a radical Democrat to being a communist. And he actually looks at Britain as holding up a mirror to the rest of the world. And at the time, that would have included the Chartist party, especially its physical force wing, and the prospect of the working class coming to power in Britain appeared to be real. And you could imagine proletarian power in Britain, where if you looked at the rest of Europe, they would still be looking for the bourgeois revolution and the working class basically constituting itself to the extent that it existed as a party of extreme opposition. Okay, so we all know the story. Chartism was defeated, as well as the revolution on the continent. And what must have struck Marx as frustrating and something that needed to be explained was the absence of the working class movement in Britain politically, because here was the most advanced capitalism, the biggest capitalism, by far the biggest working class on the planet. And where the working class developed tended to be in the form of skilled trade unionism, and later, much later, in the direction of general unions, unskilled unions. And of course, by the time we're getting, after the death of Marx and after the death of Engels, this still must have struck orthodox Marxists. We've been talking about Kautsky and the German comrades, but Lenin, this still must have struck them as strange. And of course, we know that they came up with various theoretical explanations. Nonetheless, here you are, still the biggest working class in the world, absent from the Second International. And of course, what we have is, the SDF, the Social Democratic Federation, that was formed, but a small organization, the Independent Labour Party, again, a very small organization, but not the great battalions that you would expect from a country like Britain. So when we move towards the formation of the Labour Party, while that's not greeted with, just, 3 cheers, it was nonetheless greeted with 2 cheers, because here at last, the working class in Britain was starting to move, and it was viewed as moving towards social democracy, to use the language of the day. So what we had was a very strange party as far as the Europeans were concerned, because if you look at the Second International, it basically had 2 routes in to it. It had the trade union route and would accept affiliation from trade unions into a trade union section. And, basically the trade unions were, looked at as, how should I put it, fighters on the economic field that could be influenced by Marxists and the Marxist program. And on the other hand, you had parties organized on the basis of one member, one vote, that sort of type party. That what distinguished the Marxists in particular was the commitment to political action, which to put it, crudely, meant using whatever electoral opportunities there were to build the vote, to build the organization, to educate the working class, and to use, if you did get anyone elected, to use the parliament, not in order to legislate socialism into existence, but use parliament as a tribune in order to agitate. And maybe the expectation was, and I think that was the expectation, that at some point the socialists would win a majority in parliament, depending on the particular system. And they expected the bourgeoisie, to use the language of Marx and Engels, to stage a slave owners' rebellion. And they had all sorts of ideas about how to combat that. But the long and the short of it was that they were going to rely on splitting the army because they'd been campaigning for a people's army, not a professional army. And such an army, they basically thought, could be split. Even if it was a professional army, the fact that lots of people in a professional army come from the working class, these people could be persuaded to back the government that or the legitimate authority of the Socialist Party. Anyway, we all know the debate in the International about the affiliation of the Labour Party. It did pose them a bit of a problem because it was neither fish nor fowl. The Labour Party had no individual members at the time. It was made up of affiliates. It was made up in terms of numbers, mainly by the trade unions. That's what gave them, political weight. But they also had a situation of where the socialist societies, and there were three that were named, had automatic representation on the National Executive Committee, the ruling committee of the Labour Party. Just worthwhile mentioning who they were. The SDF was given 2 automatic seats. The ILP, the Independent Labour Party, was given 2, and the Fabians were given 1. And if you take those 3 organizations, you characterize them as the left, the center, and the right. And it's interesting just looking at the founding documents and debates around the Labour Party, that the SDF and the ILP in particular were valued because of their ideas. These ideas weren't considered far out and dangerous. They were actually welcomed in. Either way, we have a debate in the International. Famously or notoriously, the leader of the SDF, Henry Hyman, he didn't support the affiliation of the Labour Party. Indeed, he didn't support the affiliation of the Labour Party, having gone along to the founding conference of the Labour Party and tabled a motion that the Labour Party would commit itself to the class struggle, to the class war for socialism. The Labour Party voted that down, and the SDF, instead of taking up their 2 NE seats, their 2 automatic seats on the leadership, and maybe they would have got others through the trade unions or the co-op, I don't know, not beyond possibility, but they walked out. And therefore, when it came to the International, Henry got up and said, we can't support the Labour Party. It refuses to commit to the class struggle. It refuses to commit to the class war. And of course, Trotsky, the authoritative leader of the International, gets up and argues, well, in practice, the Labour Party conducts the class struggle. Yes, they voted that down at their founding conference, but the reality is that the Labour Party stands in elections. It fights the class struggle through the trade unions. So there isn't really a problem. It's just worthwhile quoting Lenin in this. He sort of attempts to move he fails. He tries to move an amendment. And basically his line is, well, no, the Labour Party doesn't fight the class struggle. If you look at its political leadership, he didn't pick out the Fabians for criticism. He picked out what he would call the independent Labour Party. I'm sort of trying to pick my tone in the sneer correctly with, with the correct sneer on the word independent. It was the so-called independent Labour Party, because the reality of the Labour Party is, although it stood candidates, it in reality acted as the tail of the great Liberal Party. What traditionally was viewed as the party of the industrial capitalists. And we know that the Labour Party did all sorts of deals when it came to elections. And basically the message was, where we aren't standing, vote Liberal. And where we are standing, this is being done as part of a deal with the Liberal Party. And in Parliament, what Labour MPs basically did wasn't to constitute themselves as a party separate from the Liberal Party, but as allies of the Liberal Party. They were the equivalent of the Home Rule Party in Ireland, an adjunct. Although formally separate from the Liberal Party, they act as an adjunct of the Liberal Party. And of course, this was done in the name of, making genuine steps forward, getting real concessions off the Liberal Party and keeping the Tories out. You've heard it 1,000 times before. That was the justification. But having said that, what Lenin argued is, okay, we know about the politics of the Labour Party. It is in reality politically liberal. It isn't independent. Nevertheless, this represents a big step forward for the British working class. And given the importance of the British working class when we're looking at global politics, not just because of the British Empire, although that wasn't irrelevant, but the actual size and potential of the working class in Britain, Lenin was prepared to say, okay, we'll have it in as a political, we'll recognize it as a political party, even though it isn't really a political party. Okay. So let's just talk about Lenin's later characterization of the Labour Party. And of course, we know in left-wing communism, when there's a debate about affiliation to the Labour Party, he's quoting various communists from Britain who are describing the Labour Party, for example, as the representation of the trade unions in Parliament, or the political expression of the trade union movement, and other such formulations. And Lenin comes out with this phrase, no, it's a bourgeois workers' party, because although you've got workers voting for it, although you've got now individual membership of the Labour Party made up overwhelmingly of working class people, and although the trade unions are affiliated to it, look at the politics of the Labour Party. He describes them as bourgeois, and indeed he describes the leadership of the Labour Party as reactionaries of the worst kind. Why of the worst kind? Because they pretended to be socialists. If you look at the Tories, of course, they were reactionaries, but they didn't pretend to be socialists. If you look at the Liberals, they didn't pretend to be socialists. But the ILP, people like Henderson and MacDonald, did pretend to be socialists. And indeed, we know in 1918, the Labour Party sent off the Fabian, Sidney Webb, to write their famous Clause 4. They had pressure on them from the left. There was a mass upsurge of industrial militancy, but also political struggle. There was also mass sympathy for the Russian Revolution. And indeed, you know, as part of the working class mobilization against the war danger of Britain basically backing Poland in a war to bring down the Russian Revolution, the working class movement in Britain, including MacDonald, actually talked about threatening a general strike, but also forming Soviets, including Soviets of soldiers. So these people were able to pose left. They sent away Sidney Webb, who knew something of the history of German social democracy. And of course, what we had, you know, through his pen is the most anti-Marxist commitment to socialism that he thought he could get away with. In other words, if you look at Marx's criticism, which became public, of the Gotha program, basically he was writing a commitment to state socialism as opposed to proletarian socialism. So the emphasis was on nationalization and workers getting back the full return of their labor, stuff that Marx, of course, famously criticized. Okay, so that was Lenin's, how should I put it, label to describe the Labour Party. But I don't think it was just a label. I think it does describe or capture the contradictory nature of the Labour Party. Now, no one's arguing, at least I'm not, that the Labour Party has ever been anything more than a bourgeois workers' party. But I would argue, and this is what you know, the CPGB has committed itself to, we would argue that it has the potential, at least, to resolve the contradiction between these two poles, the bourgeois pole, which is historically dominant, and the proletarian pole, which has traditionally been subordinate. It has the potential to reverse that, to put the proletarian pole in command, and that means politically in command, and resolve that contradiction by driving out the right, by driving out the pro-capitalist bureaucracy and careerists. Okay, so let's just go back to a little bit of history. Having mentioned left-wing communism, we know that it has the argument about affiliation to the Labour Party. I've mentioned that already. It's interesting when we look at the first Congress of the CPGB, what was it, July the 31st to August the 1st, 1920, it must have come as a shock to the leadership, at least the dominant section of the leadership, what opposition they faced when it came to this affiliation, even though they all knew about Lenin, and Lenin sent a letter welcoming the formation of the CPGB, but also urging them to participate in parliamentary elections. That didn't prove to be particularly controversial, but to also affiliate to the Labour Party. And that did prove controversial. And it's interesting, just reading the minutes of that Congress, how many people got up from the BSP, the British Socialist Party, which was the new name of the Social Democratic Federation that I mentioned back there from the 19th century. It's interesting how many of them got up and said, well, we shouldn't have anything to do with the Labour Party. And I can tell you that from first-hand experience, because I'm a member of the Labour Party. Indeed, I'm a councillor of the Labour Party, and I can tell you what a load of shits the Labour Party contains, that sort of type speech, as well as speeches, of course, as you would expect from comrades that were always hostile to the Labour Party, such as those that came from the Socialist Labour Party, which we don't need to go into the origins of. Suffice to say that in 1916, Henry Hyman, his leadership had been overthrown. This was an anti-war rebellion by the left wing of the BSP, who adopted a left centrist position when it came to the war. But they also decided to affiliate to the Labour Party. This is in the middle of World War I. So you've got a left-wing victory at the Easter conference of the BSP. Henry Hyman has walked out and formed the what would now be an unfortunately named National Socialist Party, and they apply to affiliate to the Labour Party. And the Labour Party just turns around, shrugs its shoulders and said, well, of course. So it's quite interesting. The Labour Party was pro-war. The Labour Party enters the war cabinet. We should just mention the first Labour Party Prime Minister, that's still to come, but Ramsay MacDonald. He actually adopts a right centrist position, a social pacifist position, but he resigns as leader of the Labour Party. So the Labour Party is officially pro-war, but it's clearly got a pacifistic and even anti-war minority. But anyway, the main point I'm making is that the affiliation of the BSP is unproblematic, as far as I know, at least. All I know is it got a majority, or it got the nod. I don't know any more about it than that, but it becomes an affiliate. Things have all changed, though, by the time that the Communist Party of Great Britain is formed, and it's formed basically from a merger of this British Socialist Party and some smaller groups. The South Wales Socialist Society sort of is part of it. Various shop stewards, revolutionary shop stewards come in. The left wing, or the more sane wing of the Socialist Labour Party comes in. But the long and the short of it is, at that point, the Labour Party decides, no, they cannot have affiliation from the CPGB. The CPGB could have perhaps said that we've simply changed our name, and that might have produced a different result. Who knows? The main point is, though, that what you've got is Britain and the capitalist class basically recoiling from the Russian Revolution in fear, because what the Russian Revolution has shown is that the capitalist class is mortal, that this capitalism that decisively breaks through in Britain actually is vulnerable to its own creation, the working class, the class that whatever they do, they can't do without. We all know the phrase about the grave digger, and that's what they saw in Russia. So the generalization of the Russian Revolution in the form of communist parties, the foundation of the Third International, is viewed as a mortal threat. And we've got to understand the reaction of the right wing and the trade union bureaucracy in that light. And the Communist Party applies to affiliate again and again and again. It's barred. The Labour Party indeed changed its rules. And what we have is a process in the Labour Party beginning really, well, you could argue 1918, but let's just call it 1920, and the application to apply to affiliate from the CPGB. You have a process of entrenching the domination of the right, and the, how should I put it, the marginalization of the radical left. So we have a whole series of measures where individual communists are barred from standing as Labour candidates. The first CPGB MP actually was a defector from the Liberal Party, believe it or not. But the first communist MPs were either communist Labour MPs, i.e. backed, communist candidates backed by their local Labour Party, CLP, or they were actually official candidates of the Labour Party. But the Labour Party starts passing measures preventing that, saying that if anyone adopts a communist as their official candidate or backs a communist candidate, we'll close you down. We have a whole series of measures of where individual communists are barred from membership. There's rebellion over that. London Labour Party is closed down. Lots of other CLPs are disaffiliated, decapitated. But the long and the short of it is that the right wing wins. And although the communists keep recruiting in the Labour Party and often leaving people in there and organising in the Labour Party, what we have in that 1920s period is the birth of the modern Labour Party, or the forging of the modern Labour Party. Okay, in other words, the affiliation tactic, which was designed maybe to get in, yes, and then communist influence grows, that will be Lenin's calculation, or as Lenin argued, if they turn you down, you can turn around and expose people like Ramsay MacDonald. He calls himself a socialist, but look at these great fighters in the Communist Party, the cream of the working class, that they're barring from the Labour Party. These people aren't real socialists. And you have the phrase, don't you, as part of those tactics, the rope supports, supporting the hanging man, i.e., yes, we can vote Labour, but the task of the communists is to expose the Labour Party. And that can include electing a Labour government. Okay, so what we have in more modern times, in particular with the followers of Leon Trotsky, who find themselves in a tiny, tiny minority, find themselves driven out of the Third International. You have this famous French turn. And this becomes a generalized tactic. I'll call it a tactic for the moment. And basically what this is the idea that parties of the Second International are being radicalized in the conditions of the 1930s. And that's true after the triumph of Nazism in Germany. You have these parties start to produce, a radical left wing, in part that cynicism because the masses themselves are being radicalized. Nonetheless, Trotsky advises his comrades to enter these parties, but the idea was always going to be short term. You're either going to get expelled or you leave at an opportune moment, i.e. What we're talking about is entrism. You could call it smash and grab. Either way, Trotsky thought that this way he could build up his forces, overcome the isolation of his fellow thinkers on a world scale. That was applied in Britain, not only in the conditions, though, of the 1930s, it was also applied in the conditions of the post-World War II situation, not least in the long boom. Again, the Trotskyists were originally expecting a massive upsurge in the class struggle. They didn't expect capitalism to stabilize itself. They thought that there would be very quickly another world war. Instead, what we had is the victory of America, the defeat, in effect, not only of Germany and Italy and Japan, but also the defeat of the British Empire, the subordination of Britain basically to the United States, that was most famously illustrated with the Suez Canal fiasco in 1956, where the United States told Britain and France to get out because they are now in charge, not Britain, not France anymore. Anyway, the followers of Leon Trotsky, having been, disappointed by the results of the immediate post-World War II situation, having actually been completely disorientated, in terms of their strategic perspectives, lots of them end up going into the Labour Party, and they go into the Labour Party either with the view of short-term entrism or in the form of Peter Taft and Ted Grant. They go in with a view of long-term entrism. So if we look at the origins of today's Socialist Workers' Party in Britain, it goes back to the Socialist Review group. If we look at today's Workers' Revolutionary Party, it goes back to something called the Group. If we look at whatever they're called, anti-capitalist resistance or whatever they're called nowadays, again, we've got the same sort of origins deep in the Labour Party, of where these comrades basically thought that they could gain a hearing. What we've argued in the CPGB is that the conditions that we face today actually require something else, that we really don't see the benefit to the working class of some sort of smash and grab raid. We don't see any benefit of long-term entrism, not least because we look at the example of Militant, and basically they actually act as, well, they adapted to their surroundings. They became, to all intents and purposes, Labourites. And if you look at their various programs, everything relied on a Labour government, everything relied on the troops, the courts, everything, abides by the Constitution. And the basic idea was that you would elect a Labour government committed to a socialist program, and it would busily carry it out. I mean, to me, that's a classic reformist strategy. So these Trotskyists basically become common or garden reformists. And I'm talking about reformism with a view to socialism, as opposed to reforming the existing capitalism and tinkering with a bit of legislation here and a bit of legislation there. They were committed to a socialism. It was just that it would come as a result of reformist methods. And of course, as Rosa Luxemburg famously said, what methods you choose will also actually determine the outcome. Either way, what we've argued in terms of a strategy is basically to go back, as Stan was referring to it, refounding the Labour Party as a party of Labour. The reason why we came out with that slogan is because at the time, if I'm correct, Stan, we had Peter Hain, if I remember right, who was presiding over a refounding of the Labour Party. This was under Red Ed Miliband. And from my memory, again, it might be a bit hazy, but didn't that involve the Collins Review and this idea of basically going in terms of the Labour leadership, not only to have a one member, one vote, but even to have a situation of where people could sign up as supporters and have a vote for the Labour leadership. Basically, the model is America. And their, how should I put it, system of primaries. And of course, in the heads of the right, they thought they were on a safe bet here because the capitalist class, their friends, control the BBC, the ITV, Sky News, the Daily Mirror. We won't worry about the Daily Telegraph too much, but the Sun even could sign up people, because all you needed, I think, was a five quid and you could get a vote. That was their idea. Anyway, we put forward our document saying, no, we don't want this stuff. What we want is basically the original principles, not original, the original structure of the Labour Party. That what we want is the right of socialist groups to affiliate to the Labour Party. But also what we will be struggling for is to equip the Labour Party not with a renewed or restored old Fabian Clause 4, that what we would be fighting for is Marxist leadership of the Labour Party and equipping the Labour Party with a Marxist programme. Now, this really brings me, I suppose, and it's not going to take me long to say, well, if you've got a Marxist leadership and a Marxist program, what's the need for a Marxist party? Well, precisely the argument we would put forward is that what the Labour Party is, if you want to characterize it. It's closer in terms of its structure to Soviets that were thrown up in 1905 in Russia and in 1917, i.e. trade unions can affiliate to it. There aren't any soldiers Soviets, at least at the moment. The peasantry doesn't exist in Britain, but what you've got is a mass working class through their trade unions, but also you've got various socialist organizations at the time, Socialist Workers' Party, Socialist Party in England and Wales, the CPGB, the CPB, the Morning Stars Party, and a lot of others. These should have the right to affiliate to it. But precisely, we recognize the limitations of the Labour Party, because what we are talking about is trade unions, and in Britain, at least unlike Europe, these are not what I'm not going to say non-political, that would be a mistake, but they include all workers in a particular trade. They're not organized on the basis of one's religion or one's political affiliation necessarily. So although some trade unions in Britain, such as, for example, the GMB, actually, if you look at their rule book, it says we're going to fight for socialism. I think that rule was actually written by Marx's daughter, and they've still got it. I think the same applies to the, what's the name of it? The RMT, the Rail Workers Union. I think they also have a socialist clause that goes back to the 19th century. But the point I'm making is that through the trade unions and the trade union voter conference, what you have, even if that's democratized with some sort of PR system, is still a position of where you've got people in it who ain't necessarily socialists, and we wouldn't want to see the trade unions purged, but would have a vote in such a body. Now, in Russia, there were those that put forward the idea later of Soviets without Bolsheviks. It was also a situation, and this again illustrates the title. It's also worthwhile pointing out that as the Soviets in 1917 were supporting the provisional government, its war policy, their refusal to distribute land to the peasantry, that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were seriously considering abandoning the Soviets. That there are, Lenin speeches or Lenin articles saying basically the Soviets are dead, they're useless. And there were thoughts about maybe the shop stewards committees that were coming up. Whatever it was, the Bolsheviks didn't fetishize, at least not in 1917 Soviets. And if you look at Trotsky, it's interesting, isn't it? That when he joins the Bolsheviks and when he's put in charge of organizing the revolution, the uprising, the overthrow of the provisional government, he actually persuades Lenin that instead of doing it in the name of the Bolshevik Party, which was gaining majority after majority after majority in the Soviets, in the trade unions, in local council elections, wherever there were elections, the Bolsheviks were on a very steep upward curve to the point of obtaining crushing majorities in the two capitals of Moscow and Petrograd, as it was by then known as. But Trotsky persuades Lenin that we need to time the revolution to coincide with the Congress of the Workers' Soviets, and I think it was Workers and Soldiers Soviets meeting in one hall, but also coinciding with the Peasant Congress. And basically what happens there is the Bolsheviks go along and say, oh, by the way, we've seized power on your behalf. I mean, that was basically it. And of course, there was a Bolshevik left SR majority in the Workers and Soldiers Soviets. And there was wasn't much of a Bolshevik presence in the Peasant Soviets. There would be some, but there was a left SR majority in the Peasant Soviets, and the Peasants Soviet vote to say, yeah, great, we're in power, and they form a coalition government. But the point I'm trying to illustrate here is, although we have that as a strategic perspective, we're not fetishizing the Labour Party. We recognize that we could lose. We recognize that the Labour Party could become so bureaucratized. Maybe someone will argue that it is so bureaucratized, it couldn't be used that way. All I would say at the moment is it's too early to say, because if you look at the forces that we've got available, they are pathetic. We're extremely weak. And I'm not talking simply about the CPGB. I'm talking about the left as a whole. In other words, I'm arguing that as part of this sort of necessary fields of struggle that we need to engage on, there's the Labour Party and there's the trade unions. And once you raise it that way, and we would have a program of turning the trade unions, to use the phrase, into schools of communism. So we would equip trade unions, again, with a Marxist leadership, with a Marxist commitment to socialism. Yes, yes, yes. But if you fail, you fail. The program isn't reliant on winning majorities in trade unions, but clearly at the present, the idea of just going round these bodies is equivalent of saying you shouldn't bother to stand in Parliament. And indeed, of course, there are those that say you shouldn't stand in Parliament. I just think that's missing an opportunity. But think about the Bolsheviks. They stood in a Parliament that was far more undemocratic than the one that's been described by Ben Lewis today in Prussia. It was indirect elections. The workers and the peasants didn't get any sort of proportional representation. The church, the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie were massively overrepresented. And even that often fell foul of the Tsar, that if he didn't like what the parliament had voted for, he simply closed it down, changed the rules. Nonetheless, the Bolsheviks, apart from, I think it was 2 boycotts, wasn't it? One which was right and one which wasn't right, stood in those elections. And of course, famously in 1912, they win the vote in the Workers' Courier, the workers section, where they elect delegates to the Tsarist Duma. Okay, so what time are we on? Right, time to move towards wrapping it up. Okay, so that was our perspective, as Stan said, going back to, he says, 2011, whatever it happens to be. And then something amazing happens. Not that we expected it, not that anyone expected it. And that is Jeremy Corbyn stands for leader of the Labour Party. Well, that wasn't unexpected. Basically, what was left of the so-called socialist campaign group of MPs looked around the little room that they were in, and having, done it last 2 times, or tried to do it last 2 times, and didn't we have Diane Abbott also there? And they both either didn't get on the ballot or they failed miserably. They said, oh, it's Jeremy's turn. And Jeremy must have turned and said, oh, God's sake, do I have to? And they would have turned around and said, well, we've done it before. You've got to do it. We don't stand a chance, but hey, we've got to keep the flag flying here. So no one thought that they would get, was it the 40 signatures from MPs that was required to get onto the ballot? They didn't have enough people in the socialist campaign group to deliver anything like that. So I always remember we had a comrade who wrote an article, and I thought it was a good article. And he basically wrote an article saying, what you've got to do is lobby your MPs, and you've got to lobby them on the basis of, well, the left, it's a legitimate voice, and at least it ought to be part of the debate when it comes to the election of the leader. And I just thought to myself, well, we don't have a chance here. But I wrote to my local MP. She actually did end up, not because of me, I hasten to add, but she actually did end up nominating Jeremy Corbyn. And there were quite a few others. And of course, the most famous one that did that was, I think, a former leader of the Labour Party. She was only leader of the Labour Party, I think, for a matter of months, wasn't she? Was it Frances Beckett? She was a sort of caretaker leader. Anyway, she famously lent Jeremy her vote. And
Margaret Beckett, wasn't it? Margaret.
Margaret Beckett. I thought I said that. Did I say Francis Beckett?
Yeah.
Okay, my mistake. Margaret Beckett. But yeah, she famously lent Jeremy her vote. And after we saw the result, she turned around and described herself as one of the morons that allowed Jeremy in. And for my credit, and I'm not claiming some sort of how should I put it, great predictive powers. I often get these things wrong. Nonetheless, when I saw the first debate, leadership debate, staged by the BBC, it was in Nuneaton, in front of ex-Labour voters. You had the candidates lined up at the front. I just went to myself, fuck me, excuse the Anglo-Saxon, Jeremy Corbyn is going to win. And of course, what you had is a massive influx into the Labour Party of people either joining as full members or joining as supporters, paying their £5. I can remember doing stalls on this or that demonstration in central London, and some Tory coming up to our stall and saying, I've joined the Labour Party and I'm going to vote Jeremy Corbyn. And I can always remember comments trying to persuade him not to because he's a Tory. I just say, no, it's great. It's great. But the reality was that Corbyn would have won with the existing membership. He didn't rely on the £5 membership. He didn't rely on the new influx. That simply boosted his victory. First round of victory. And this was with, as I said, full members, individual members of the Labour Party, affiliate members of the Labour Party, and supporter members of the Labour Party. Okay, so we suddenly had this completely unexpected event. This is completely different from George Lansbury, the sort of pacifist leader of the Labour Party in the 1930s, taking over from Ramsay MacDonald, who sold out and joins the Liberals, but crucially the Tories in the national government. This is completely different. Jeremy Corbyn was not put in power or into office by the trade union bureaucracy or the parliamentary Labour Party. He was put in from below. And what this reflected was mass discontent in the country over the Iraq war, over austerity, over 101 other different issues. And mass discontent found its expression in the personality of Corbyn, with all of his virtues and with all of his faults. But let's emphasize it, he was very much a Bonapartist figure. And of course, we had hopes, I readily confess it, that there would be radical measures carried through under his leadership, that he would be open to pressure from the left. And that's exactly what the right feared. That's exactly what the establishment feared. So they were not relaxed about Jeremy Corbyn being leader of the Labour Party. We had, not only the BBC opening up a propaganda war, the Sun, the Mirror, the Guardian, we had generals, serving generals, writing articles, I think in the Daily Telegraph, a sort of Tory paper, saying that we will not obey orders from Jeremy Corbyn if he becomes Prime Minister. We had former heads of MI6 and MI5, the Secret Service, Foreign and Domestic Secret Service in Britain, basically saying we would overthrow him, that he is not to be trusted, that we would not have his advisors getting prime ministerial communications from the Secret Service, because they were members of this former CPGB, official CPGB faction called Straight Left. These people basically were viewed as completely untrustworthy, and you would have thought, well, they were untrustworthy. And also you had, of course, Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump's man, coming to Britain and being informed of the situation with Jeremy Corbyn and the danger that he could potentially be elected, not just leader of the Labour Party, but elected by Parliament as Prime Minister if he got a vote of confidence. He said, well, we'll push back. And of course, what that promised is a coup, sanctions, subversion, you name it. And of course, I remember having conversations with comrades in the Labour Party and raising this danger. And they said, well, if that happened, if Jeremy Corbyn, led the Labour Party in, to a successful general election and wasn't allowed to become Prime Minister, there'll be a revolution. And I just asked, well, where are your guns? Where are your army battalions? How are you going to stage a revolution? And of course, that is something that the left didn't warn about. Indeed, if you look at the left, either they subordinated themselves to Corbyn and his appeasement of the right. So Momentum could be mentioned, but the Labour Representation Committee, the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, nothing must upset Corbyn's attempt to appease the right. But also what we had is a left outside the Labour Party that viewed these developments in the Labour Party as a threat to their sect comfort zone, their sect regime. So the Socialist Workers' Party would tell you that the Labour Party is a complete diversion, that what really matters in politics is street demonstrations and strikes, not committee rooms. And you just think about the Bolsheviks and the Social Democratic Labour Party and Soviets. This, Soviet elections and debates took place indoors, not on the street, not through strikes, but debates, right? Committees and conferences. So the Socialist Workers' Party said this is a danger. Well, it was a danger to them. Socialist Party in England and Wales and their Tusk project, Trade Union and Socialist Coalition project, their replacement Labour, it was viewed as a threat to them. And that was true for the Morning Star. The Morning Star Communist Party, their General Secretary, Bob Griffiths, actually said to the witch hunt, this was organised by the General Secretary of the Labour Party, the anti-Corbyn General Secretary, if you can name names, I will expel them from the CPB if my members have joined the Labour Party. I just think that this tells you something about the left. Here you are, it was an unexpected, I readily admit, opportunity to advance the cause of the left, to transform the Labour Party, to open up the Labour Party to affiliation and a political reorientation. You might have lost, but not to have tried, surely was criminal. But we lost. And what we got out of the Corbyn years, yes, was a great, an unexpected performance in 2017, but a very sad and expected performance. We could go in about the witch hunt and anti-Zionism and all the rest of it. I haven't got the time. The long and the short of it is, though, that what we ended up with is some minor tinkering with the reselection of MPs, none of who were deselected under Corbyn. Some resigned, some walked out, which was great, but none of them were overthrown by the rank and file. And of course, what we got is, having had the potential to carry out a radical transformation, what we've had in reaction to that is a radical counter-transformation. And what is happening at the present time is that expulsions have doubled. People are being expelled on absolutely for crazy reasons. And that was true even under Corbyn. If you question the extent of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, if you say there's a witch hunt, that's the basis for expulsion. And indeed, the latest one that's come to my mind is a guy called Graham Bash. He's the editor of Labour Briefing, the paper or the journal of the Labour Representation Committee. He actually was expelled with no appeal for signing a petition of this organisation, Labour Against the Witch Hunt, 2 years ago. Wasn't banned, LAW law wasn't banned. He signed a petition, they've gone in, they've researched it, you're expelled. Now, under these circumstances, I can well understand why individuals, members who are people who are members of sects of one, say that we've got to give up on the Labour Party. This is completely hopeless, because if you raise any objections, if you open your mouth, you get expelled. And I well understand, the dilemma of such comrades. But if you think about it strategically, and you think about it strategically in light of the fight for a communist party, the last thing communists should do is, having seen the bourgeois state and the bourgeois establishment purge and drive forward a witch hunt in the Labour Party, the last thing we should do is do them a favour by encouraging people to walk out, or for that matter, don't stand in terms of trade unions to go along to a Labour Party conference and intervene in the Labour Party. That would be the equivalent precisely of the boycottism that Lenin spoke about from his own left wing when it came to standing in this most dreadful anti-democratic Tsarist Duma, that there were advocates of saying that we shouldn't have anything to do with it, that this is an abomination. And Lenin argued against those comments and called them anti-party. And so, although I understand the dilemma of such comrades, the idea of doing the ruling class a favour does strike me as anti-party. And I would apply that to the trade unions. I would apply that to Parliament and local councils. I'd also apply it to the Labour Party. And I'll finish with that one, Stan. Thank you.